The Leaders Debates Commission has released its program for Thursday night's English debate, and immigration will not be on the agenda.
The Green Party has been excluded from participating in the federal leaders' debates after strategically deciding to pull candidates from ridings where conservatives are leading.
A new poll shows most Canadians believe that consumers are paying the price when it comes to the industrial carbon tax. Hello Canada, it's Thursday, April 17th, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Cosmin, Dzsurdzsa.
And I'm Geoff Knight.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. The Federal Leaders Debates Commission has axed the topic of immigration from the English language debate on Thursday. Despite immigration being an election issue for voters across Canada, organizers of the English language debate quietly dropped immigration from the list of approved topics. No explanation has been given, meaning English-speaking Canadians will not hear federal leaders directly debate immigration policy ahead of the April 28th vote in their native language, but instead had to rely on live translations of the Francophone debate last night. Immigration remains a top concern not only for Quebecers, but according to a Leger poll conducted for the Association for Canadian Studies, 65% of Canadians say immigration levels are too high. That number has risen steadily from just 35% in 2019, marking one of the most dramatic shifts in public opinion in recent Canadian history. Even among Canadians who identify as part of a visible minority, 38% said they hold a negative view of immigration in Canada. Among rural residents, nearly 70% agreed immigration levels are too high, compared to 63% of urban respondents. The themes for the English debate, selected by a media consortium that includes CBC, CTV, Global News, APTN, CPAC, and TVO Steve Paikin, exclude immigration. Instead, the topics will be affordability, energy, crisis leadership, public safety, and tariffs. So we heard last night party leaders debate immigration quite extensively and provide their own views on the topic, but it was in French. And if you weren't listening to the live English translations, which at times are not perfect translations of what's being said, you wouldn't have any idea of what each party leader specifically believes and wants to do if they're elected prime minister. But when we look at the polls, we cited a nationwide poll here in the article, Geoff. But what does support for immigration look like when we break this down by province?
The support for the statement, "Overall there is too much immigration to Canada," shows a clear provincial breakdown that underscores growing concerns across the country, especially relevant given the Leaders Debates Commission's decision to sideline immigration from the English language debate. Manitoba and Saskatchewan lead the pack, with 63% of residents agreeing there's too much immigration, while only 34% disagree. Alberta mirrors this exactly, also hitting 63% in agreement and 34% in disagreement, reflecting a strong prairie sentiment. The Atlantic provinces follow with 56% agreeing and 39% disagreeing, closely trailed by Quebec at the same, 56% agreement and a slightly narrower 42% disagreement. British Columbia rounds it out with 53% agreeing and 43% disagreeing, showing the least intensity among those regions. Interestingly, the survey notes that Quebec ranks third, suggesting the issue resonates even more in English Canada, where rural areas like the Prairies and Atlantic provinces show particularly high concern, nearly 70% in rural spots versus 63% in urban ones. This provincial spread highlights a broad unease, with the Prairies standing out as the most vocal, which makes the debate emission feel like a missed opportunity to address a pressing voter issue. The Green Party will no longer participate in the federal leaders' debates after failing to meet the participation requirements, largely due to their strategic decision to pull candidates from ridings where conservatives are projected to win. The Leaders' Debates Commission wrote in a statement, quote, "Deliberately reducing the number of candidates running for strategic reasons is inconsistent with the Commission's interpretation of party viability, which Criterion 3 was designed to measure. The Commission concludes that the inclusion of the leader of the Green Party of Canada in those circumstances would undermine the integrity of the debates and the interests of the voting public. Criterion 3 requires that, quote, 28 days before the date of the general election, the party has endorsed candidates in at least 90% of federal ridings. While the Commission had invited the Green Party to participate in the French and English debates because it met all requirements in March, The invitation was revoked after reducing the number of candidates the party would field in this election. The party had initially submitted a list of 343 names, but now only has 232 candidates listed, according to Elections Canada. In addition to the latest removal of those 15 candidates expected to lose out to Conservatives, the Green Party would still be left without representation in 96 ridings across Canada. Despite this, the Green Party claimed that they still met the necessary debate criteria, calling the decision an attempt to, quote, silence them, according to party co-leader Jonathan Pedneau. However, the commission concluded that the party's decision to remove candidates for strategic reasons was the reason for their removal from the debate. So, Cosmin, what reasons have the Green Party cited for their decision to remove candidates from certain ridings?
Yeah, so it was a really abrupt change. The Green Party came out this week saying that essentially they wouldn't run candidates in over 100 ridings, and specifically pointed to the 15 you mentioned where Conservatives were leading. But what they said was that in the field, they essentially heard from local progressives, meaning NDP and Liberal voters, most likely those who are changing their vote to vote for Mark Carney, that they didn't want a Green candidate to run there. And there is a vote splitting issue happening this election on the left, because a lot of NDP voters are switching their votes to the Liberals, but the holdouts, those who remain loyal to the NDP and the Greens, are being accused of splitting the vote and potentially giving the Conservatives an advantage. Now, we've seen this play out here in British Columbia. We just put out an article with Vancouver Island candidate Aaron Gunn. There was a protest that happened outside of his office in Campbell River where left-wing progressive activists were bussed out there, and they were essentially organized by a group that was protesting against vote splitting. There, the vote is split equally between the Liberals and the NDP, giving the Conservatives a big leading advantage. So we definitely see this play out. Another issue the Greens raised was that they faced bullying, so to speak, or mean language from locals, the fact that they were running candidates in their ridings. Now, I don't know how much credence to give to this. It does seem to some degree that these are excuses, and they're essentially strategically trying to find ways to help the Liberals gain an advantage in certain ridings. A majority of Canadians say that the industrial carbon tax increases the cost of living by driving up prices of everyday goods. A poll conducted by Leger found that 70% of Canadians agree that industry passes on the costs of the industrial carbon tax to consumers in the form of higher prices for goods, with 44% saying it passes on a majority of the costs and 26% saying the business only absorbs some of the costs. This is in contrast to only 9% of Canadians who say industry passes little or no cost onto consumers while absorbing the majority of the costs. Liberal leader Mark Carney, while having reduced the consumer carbon tax to $0, is a staunch defender of the industrial carbon tax. Despite concerns from Canadians, Carney has maintained that producers, not consumers, would bear the cost of emissions. Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Franco Terrazzano, said that the poll's findings contradict Carney's message on the matter. Terrazzano said, quote, "The poll shows Canadians understand that a carbon tax on business is a carbon tax on Canadians that makes life more expensive. Only 9% of Canadians believe Liberal leader Mark Carney's claim that businesses will pay most of the cost of his carbon tax." Terrazzano said that an industrial carbon tax increases the cost of the vital economic inputs that industry requires to provide goods for the Canadian market. So the Liberals essentially, at the beginning of their campaign, really ran on this issue that Mark Carney canceled the carbon tax. But in reality, we know that the law still remains in place. The federal pricing legislation, federal carbon pricing legislation is still there. It's still on the books. It will require a vote in Parliament to overturn. But what he's done is just removed, or rather reduced, the consumer portion to $0 while maintaining the industrial scale, which increases every year, in place. What reasons, Geoff, did the Liberal leader provide to Canadians when he vowed to maintain the industrial carbon tax, and what are some of the prominent criticisms the Conservatives have alleged against the carbon tax?
Yeah, Cosmin, like you said, Mark Carney has stood firm on maintaining the industrial carbon tax, and he's offered several reasons to justify his stance, despite growing public concern. In a speech on February 17th, as detailed on his campaign site, Carney argued that the tax is essential for driving Canada towards a competitive, low-carbon economy, incentivizing big polluters, large industrial emitters, to adopt cleaner technologies and positioning Canada to leapfrog the US in global markets. He's also pitched it as a fairness measure, claiming it ensures these companies pay their fair share for emissions while funding rebates for Canadians who make green choices, like energy-efficient upgrades. During a March press conference in Halifax, Carney doubled down, saying the tax keeps Canada aligned with international climate commitments, avoiding trade penalties from countries pushing green standards. However, according to a Conservative Party release on April 12th, Carney has hinted at escalating the policy, promising a bigger carbon tax to punish industries and consumers alike if they don't meet his climate goals. This is a move that critics say could hit households even harder. He's maintained that the burden stays with producers, not consumers, but the Leger poll, showing 70% of Canadians believe costs are passed on, with 44% saying a majority and 26% only some, directly contradicts this. Carney's framing leans on economic competitiveness and environmental leadership, yet his reluctance to specify the cost to Canadians, especially with threats of a larger tax, leaves that gap wide open for skepticism.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.